Must we suppress aliens to restore nature? It's a somewhat ambiguous title, and I have been asked about this word alien. It is commonly used in the ecological literature, but not necessarily so much within Australia. But I want to start by exploring this term, alien. And where else would you start but in the Oxford Dictionary, online of course. You see these familiar ideas. Perhaps the one at the bottom is the one you might be most familiar with, a hypothetical or fictional being from another world, and the blue text gives examples of the Oxford Dictionary's examples of how these words might be used. Also the idea of a foreigner, especially one who is not a naturalised citizen of the country where he or she is living. There is another variant of the meaning in the Oxford Dictionary, and that is a plant or animal species originally introduced from another country and later naturalised. So we have the example sentence here: invasive aliens, mainly weeping willows, which were the dominant species at the dam, were eradicated. And, that encapsulates, I think, our attitudes towards aliens, perhaps. Here are some pictures, of course, of some alien species, which would be familiar to many of you, ranging from the cane toad through to the blackberry and prickly pear. These other two, the forest red gum and the brush-tailed possum, Australian species that are alien invaders in New Zealand. And of course the ultimate alien invader, Homo sapiens, shown here near the South Pole. The other related idea, which is intrinsic to this, is the idea of invasion. And if you go to the Oxford Dictionary and look up invasion, you see these kinds of definitions which have to do with people making incursions and invasions of countries and unwelcome intrusions. And if you explore a little bit further, you get to discussions about xenophobia and racism. And even examples that are directly linked to biology. So, for example, in the United States in the mid-1800s, the country was being swamped by house sparrows from England and immigrants from Ireland, which were considered to have low morals, reproduced at amazing rates, and appeared to be plotting and conspiring to exploit the US at the expense of native-born Americans. In biology, alien invasion is a recent concept. It dates back apparently to around the 1840s, where botanists, people working with floras, adapted the words native and alien from common law and applied them to the flora. So they could figure out what was a true British flora. That was followed a century later by a well-known book by Charles Elton, The Ecology of Invasions by Animals and Plants, and that really that was the milestone publication in this field. As we moved into the last 2 decades, invasion biology and conservation biology are major fields of scientific research. Now, in the 2000s, there seems to be a consensus, and if you browse government websites, you will find statements like this from the South African government. Invasive alien plants are widely considered as a major threat to biodiversity, human livelihoods and economic development. And we have similar statements from the Australian government and the European Union. So everyone is concerned about invasions by non-native or alien species. There is a bit of a risk in this concern, that the concern is actually running riot, and that our semantic associations with xenophobic ideas will actually confuse the way we think scientifically. And you get this in writing about non-native species, and I've just extracted a few quotes here which range from phrases such as brutalise the native flora to the one that I like, which is pink and green Japanese terror. And we are conducting a war on weeds with you know, appropriate signage. However, as a scientist, one has to ask, is the native versus alien division a useful guiding conservation principle? Are we allowing this sort of inherent attitudes that's in our language to actually lead us places where the science perhaps shouldn't take us? You could put it this way. So here in this diagram we have species origin. We've got the dichotomy between native and alien, and from now on I'm going to say non-native. I'm not going to use the word alien. So we have native and non-native. And then we have some ideas about function in the ecosystem. So when species interact with other species and influence the ecosystem, they could be considered to be beneficial or harmful. And the idea is that if it's native, it's beneficial. If it's alien or non-native, it's harmful. And going with that is the assumption that if it's native, it's not going to be harmful, and if it's not native, it can't be beneficial. And so I'm concerned, in the remainder of this lecture, I'm concerned with examining that assumption a bit more closely. And I'm not alone in this. There have been other suggestions that this may be misguided conceptual and ideological baggage. For example, Davis and others writing in Nature a couple of years ago said, "It is time for conservationists to focus much more on the functions of species and much less on where they originated." So we could ask, why is there so much recent biological invasion? And the first reason is that we are moving species around. People are responsible for most of these biological invasions. And they've been pretty effective. If you look at plants, for example, estimated proportions of plants in different countries range from about 10% in Australia to 47% in New Zealand. Hard to estimate because it's always changing. Again, looking at where these come from, naturalised species in Australia, they come from all over the world, the Americas, Africa, Europe. This is plant species. Many being introduced for ornamental purposes, but a significant minority being introduced for agricultural purposes. The other factor associated with all this invasion by new species is the changes that we have been making, so again people making, to environmental conditions. And deforestation is an important part of that. So in Australia, for example, conversion of forest to agricultural land was a heroic endeavour of the early colonists. And so you have Mary Gilmore's poem there, "I split the rock, I felled the tree, the nation was because of me." A really important activity. Moving into the mid-1900s, we had emerging technology post-World War II. The Laterno tree crusher, capable of clearing 35 plus square kilometres a year. Laterno, a very interesting guy known as God's businessman. He made money from doing this in various countries that he used on his missionary endeavours. In this brief look at how we've changed the environment, I couldn't actually go past our own Queensland example, who's probably a familiar person to many of you, the Queensland Premier, Joe Bjelke-Petersen. Perhaps infamous now for his government's questionable actions, but perhaps should be better well known than he is for actually developing the technique of using a large chain between two bulldozers to clear extensive tracts of native bushland. And he also, in his early political career, the Brigalow and Other Lands Development Act, which encouraged that clearing, gave incentives for it to occur. So the net outcome, of course, of all that, early clearing and then mechanised clearing post-war, has been a large-scale conversion of the landscape. In this satellite image of southeast Queensland, the green bits are the remaining forest. It's only about 1/3 of the landscape. Most of the land is actually cattle pasture. And globally, there's been a growth in studies attempting to quantify how much of this deforestation has occurred in the last few years. And you know, I won't actually try to look at the numbers, but basically temperate forests were cleared up until the beginning of this, you know, they first went through the temperate forests, now they're going through the tropical forests. It looks as though the rate of deforestation is dropping off, but that's a little bit, it's dropped off a bit, but these time intervals are not all the same, so that's a bit misleading. This is a map of cultivated land globally. It covers a lot of the world. It doesn't include pasture. So my point here is that we've made huge changes across the face of the earth. Most of you would know that anyway. And as well as that, it's not simply deforestation, it's the addition of chemicals of different sorts, changes to the availability of water by irrigation and damming, changes to the topography of the land, and now changes to the climate. So basically we've brought huge changes to environments. We've taken away the old ones, we've brought in new ones, we've removed former species, and by this stage these new environments are not suitable to a lot of these former species, and so we now face this situation of extinctions and biodiversity decline and degradation. At the same time, we bring in new species, and we tend to bring in the kind of species which will suit the new environments, and so we encourage species invasions. We don't really know how much these species invasions are actually responsible for the extinctions and degradations, although we do like to point the finger at the invaders. The outcomes of all this are still pretty much unknown. It's happening around us right now. People who study this, actually the term novel ecosystems is becoming, gaining more attention in the ecological literature. A novel ecosystem is one which has new species in new combinations that is arising directly or indirectly from human actions. Having looked at those changes, as sort of a brief historical view of environmental changes and the idea of alien species, I now want to turn to further changes which are occurring and the concept of reforestation. So we've extensively deforested. What about reforestation? And the idea of forest transitions. So first of all, reforestation is urgently needed. It's arguably urgently needed. Even if we protect all the remaining forests, there will still be more ecosystem degradation and biodiversity decline because of time lags that are built into the system. The consequences of these changes will take decades or more to play out. So things are going to keep getting worse, even if we stop all deforestation. We could alleviate that by reforesting. So we could stop it getting worse, but if we want to make it get better, even more reforestation is required. And so, of course, there's a growing interest in this issue, reforestation. However, it's a broad church, this word. Reforestation has many forms, and at the simplest level, they range from different forms of tree planting, which could be a plantation of timber species, or it could be what we call a biodiversity planting, a very rich multi-species kind of planting of native trees. These plantings may be natives or non-natives. And this is a very active activity, of course. People are sort of getting involved in it. At the other end of the spectrum, we have the things that happen when people walk away from agricultural land. Sometimes when people stop agricultural land use, there's forest regrowth. Again, it may be native or not. And in fact, the regrowth occupies much larger land areas than the active tree planting. As well as that, this reforestation is part of a dynamic process which consists of both loss of forest due to deforestation and then gain of forest due to reforestation or afforestation, where trees are planted on land which never had them before. And so the Food and Agricultural Organisation, which periodically now, I think it's every 2 years, produces forest resources assessment reports. In their 2010 report, globally they estimated that 16 million hectares were lost between 1999 and 2000. That's deforestation. 8 were gained from reforestation of various forms and afforestation, and so there was a net loss, a net decline in forest area of 8 million hectares. And then we have somewhat similar figures in the period 2000 to 2010. So there are two things that come out of this. One is that although we've got a lot of clearing happening, we don't have quite so much net loss because some of that clearing is being offset by gains due to reforestation. But the other consequence is that much of the land that we measure as being forested is actually reforested. It's not primary or original or old growth forest. And the estimate was that in 2010, 64% of global forests were reforested land, and that is mostly regrowth. So that's caused recent attention among scientists, and not just scientists actually, scientists and social scientists, towards what's going on in this process of reforestation. And so we have what's called the forest transition hypothesis, which posits that you have this wave of deforestation, and then later on, as people get wealthy, this is a very simplified version, forest tends to come back. I've said here, current debate. It is a matter of current debate. But there are things that can drive reforestation, one being the fact that more and more people are living in cities. Populations are moving from agricultural land to live in cities. We have more intensive agriculture, which uses less land area, and there are also a raft of conservation and forest policies which may be encouraging reforestation. And what is going on? Well, people are still arguing about what really is happening here. But I do want to talk about a very local example, which is the big scrub rainforest, located sort of very roughly in the area between Byron Bay and Lismore in northern New South Wales. It used to be a very extensive area of rainforest. So let us say around about 1850, before the European settlers moved in. A century later, in 1958, if you drove to Byron Bay, you'd be driving through bare green hills with dairy pasture. 99.9% of the forest was cleared. By 2004, if you made the same trip, you would find that 25% of the landscape was forested. And this is actually regrowth forest due to decline in the dairy industry from the 1950s. If you look more closely, you'll find that this regrowth forest is largely dominated by a non-native species, the camphor laurel, which was imported from China and has now invaded the landscape. Camphor laurel, very interesting tree. It's a very attractive tree. It grows very fast. It has fleshy fruits that are moved around the landscape by birds, and it's very good at establishing and growing in old dairy pasture. And looking more generally, if you do look at the trees that establish in old dairy pasture, there's a common suite of non-native trees that do that. We call them pioneer species. So here are some examples: camphor laurel, lantana, wild tobacco, and a couple of species of privet. Now, these are considered to be weeds, So to be eradicated or suppressed. So we restore nature by eradicating or suppressing these trees. But actually a lot of the time we're restoring dairy pasture by doing this. Those comments take us towards what are real dilemmas for people involved in conservation and restoration. Dilemmas involving non-native species. And I'm going to illustrate those dilemmas with a couple of case studies focused on selected species. So just keeping on with the theme of rainforest which has been cleared to create pasture, grazed by cattle, and then something happens to cause that land use to change, so the farmers move off the land. Does the forest regenerate? Well, in many cases the forest does not regenerate. The native forest does not come back and regrow, and that seems to be because once the pasture is established, it limits the rainforest regeneration. Well, actually one reason why the forest regeneration is limited is because the seeds of the rainforest trees are short-lived. They don't persist in the soil, and therefore to get more trees growing up in this pasture they have to be moved in there by birds. So there has to be a supply of seeds and there have to be birds to move those seeds around. And in pastures you don't get many of the kinds of birds that move the seeds of trees around. The second reason that pasture often limits rainforest regeneration is that, in fact, these grasses, these pasture grasses, are very competitive. They are introduced, they are themselves introduced species, mostly from Africa or perhaps South America, and they are selected for fast growth and thick growth, and therefore it is hard for the seedlings of rainforest trees to get established amongst the grasses. And so for somebody who is interested in the idea of reforestation, you might ask, well, can we specifically, short of actually planting trees everywhere, if we do something to remove the barriers of dispersal and competition from pasture grasses, will that facilitate forest regeneration? And so that's been one of my recent research projects with other colleagues, to actually look at that process. And so if I go back to this previous slide, this is a plot in the middle of retired pasture. It hasn't been grazed for 8 years or so. There's not much regeneration in it. And this light pinky area is where the grass has been herbicided to kill it off, to stop it competing with potential rainforest seedlings. And so with the help of honour student Amelia Elgar, we've got a short-term answer at least as to what happens in the first 20 months, is that herbicide alone will increase the amount of native seedling recruitment 50-fold. If you herbicide and put in some purchase for birds, it increases to 800-fold. But more interestingly, if you look, this is a sort of fairly limited perch. In fact, shrubs will grow up in pasture, and they've also provided a perch and perhaps food resources for the birds. If we look under these shrubs and we kill the grass with herbicide, we get a 1,500 times increase in the amount of native tree seedling recruitment. And as well as that, it doesn't matter whether so that's a lantana clump, and that's a native tree species regenerating. That doesn't make any difference. The birds don't care whether it's native or non-native shrub. Underneath the native shrubs and underneath the non-native shrubs, you get an increase in native seedling recruitment. However, most of the seedling recruitment, in addition to all those native seedlings, What we mostly get are seedlings of a non-native species, the wild tobacco, which has come in from South America with the assistance of people. So after a year and a half, parts of our plots look like that. After 2.5 years, they look like that. And these are wild tobacco trees. So it's easy to facilitate non-native regeneration, and you can facilitate some native regeneration. We've also been interested in what happens in regrowth in the longer term, because I was only there talking about what happens in 2 years. If you want to find out what happens in the longer term, and you don't want to wait 20 or 30 or 40 years, you go and look for chronosequences. And a chronosequence is a bunch of sites that differ in age. And here we've looked at chronosequences of sites that have been actively replanted with a diversity of native trees, and we've looked at chronosequences of regrowth sites. And there's a fairly complex little graph here in which each point is a different site. And we've measured stem density. So this is the density of trees. From 0 to 60 years, and in pasture we've got just about none. In rainforest we've got that much. And in replanted sites where people plant trees, you get back to rainforest levels within a few years, as you'd expect. In regrowth sites, the places where people walk away and leave it to its own devices, you get back to within about 40 years. So it's a slower process, but you do acquire a lot, a reasonable number of trees. So it starts to look more like a forest. So this is after round about 15 years, replanted and regrowth. What if we consider the kind of plants that are in these forests? So this is a similar sort of graph, but it's showing the percent of these trees that are native species. And what happens in the replanted sites is that over time, the percent that are native goes down. You start off with all native species and the birds bring the seeds in of the other species. In a regrowth site, you start off with very few native species. Percent stems native is, around about 20%. And then over time, that goes up because the birds are bringing in the seeds of the native species. And the early shrubs, such as lantana, when the other species grow up around them, they die back because many of them are not tolerant of shade. If you look more closely at all of the processes involved, they can be quite complicated. This is a simplified diagram of those processes. But the most important aspect of it is that we've got something like a positive feedback cycle. When trees start to grow in pasture, they create the conditions that bring in the seeds of more trees, which when those trees grow will create the conditions that are even more suitable for growing more trees. And the nature of this positive cycle isn't affected by the origin of the species. It's going to happen the same way whether we're dealing with native species or non-native species. So I'm going to look at another case now, which is getting at the older end of the spectrum again, and go back to the big scrub, which I was talking about before, the northern New South Wales former dairy areas. And in this study, we looked at what is happening within these established areas of camphor laurel regrowth. So camphor laurel, the non-native tree, came in, it formed forests, and that's caused, that's been cause for some debate in this region. Should we say camphor laurel is invading the landscape, let's get rid of it? Or should we say, wow, we're getting reforested, isn't it wonderful that the forest is coming back and it's creating habitat for native fauna and flora? And that's an ongoing subject of debate. So we actually approached the issue empirically. by doing ecological surveys in camphor laurel regrowth areas. And we first asked whether these camphor patches were used by frugivorous birds. The answer to that was yes. A lot of frugivorous, that means fruit-eating, a lot of fruit-eating bird species use these patches. These are the birds that are going to move the seeds around the landscape, including this one, which is a regionally threatened species. Secondly, if these birds are in the camphor laurel patches and they're capable of moving seeds around, are we getting native species regenerating on the ground? And the answer to that, when you look at the data, is yes. Native species, if you look at adult trees, native species are not very well represented, but if you look at the recruiting small trees coming in, they are very well represented. There are complexities to that argument, which you can ask me about later if you're interested. The other aspect of these findings is that the new species coming in include more species that are typical of the older growth forests. And so if you look dispassionately at the role of camphor laurel forests in the landscape, there's actually a suite of different ecological benefits that are provided by these forests. So I'm not going to read through all these benefits, they're up there for you to see. Some of them we know, we have the scientific evidence to confirm, and others are speculative. So from that particular case study, we have an example where a non-native species arguably is being beneficial to ecosystem function. So now I'd like to look at the final cell in this table, which is the question of whether we should assume that native species can do no harm. If it's native, is it necessarily desirable? So native species and ecological dysfunction. And so now here I focus on another organism which I've done considerable work with, and I can see that many people in the audience are familiar with this species, the noisy miner. It is native, not to be confused with the common or Indian miner, an introduced species. In the honeyeater family, noisy miners establish in an area and they live there forever. They have very small home ranges. You know, a single bird will spend its whole life in a fraction of a hectare. And they live in groups. They're very social. They feed on insects and nectar in the trees, mostly. But they live in these groups which are incredibly aggressive. So here we have pictures of noisy miners attacking currawongs, and this is some form of pigeon. They'll attack, because they're in a big group, they'll attack other animals much larger than themselves with some success. And in fact, they tend not to be so successful in driving away the currawongs or crows or pigeons. But of course, anybody smaller than themselves is not going to be able to resist. And so, in fact, when you go and survey birds in intact native forests, most of them are small. There's an incredibly high diversity of small birds that feed on insects and nectar. Okay, the other thing about noisy miners is that they increase in numbers in areas, in the kinds of areas where people have been. So if we remove the understory of forest, or we create forest edges, or otherwise disturb the landscape, or plant eucalyptus trees in suburbs, noisy miners, that is good noisy miner habitat. And then finally, noisy miners are increasing in abundance across most of their range over time. So this is from a recent study that used data collected by Birds Australia, the national ornithological organisation, in which members of the community go out and survey birds over many years. The blue colour are areas where noisy miners have decreased in abundance, and the shades of red are areas where they have increased. So there's a general increase. There's also an increase in what we know about noisy miners. Dating back to their behaviour was studied by Doug Dow, who actually was one of my lecturers when I was a student at the University of Queensland, and he studied the behaviour of the miners he was interested in understanding their behaviour. He documented their extreme aggression. More recently, all of these different people, as the decades went past, more and more people became interested in studying the effects of human modification to eucalypt forests and woodlands. And these people did not go out to study noisy miners. They went out to study the effects of change in eucalypt forests and woodlands, and they all ended up writing papers about noisy miners. And as an outcome, partial outcome of that, there's a group called the Noisy Miner Working Group, of which I'm a member, but which is organised by Martine Marin here, a researcher from the University of Queensland. And the Noisy Miner Working Group includes a whole selection of some of these people here and others, because this is not a full list of people who've published on noisy miners. And the idea is to pool knowledge and ideas. Okay, and so I'll sort of give a couple of the interesting outcomes which support the generalised claims that I've just been making. But I'm going to start by looking at this is work that we did some years ago in Toohey Forest. This is Toohey Forest, which surrounds Griffith University. You can see it has very abrupt edges with the surrounding suburbs. And this is the abundance of noisy miners at different distances from the forest edge. And over here we have the locations of all the noisy miner colonies. Basically, there's lots of them within 100 metres of the forest edge. If you get several kilometres from the edge, they're much scarcer. When we put the data together from all of those people who've done all of those studies across eastern Australia and do a big analysis which says, what are all the factors that might influence noisy miner abundance, and we push them all into an analysis, it turns out that the most important one is distance in from the forest edge. And the result is almost identical. It's the first 100 metres. So within 100 metres of a forest edge, you're much more likely to see noisy miners. Secondly, what about their impact on bird communities? Well, again, this is a study done, this is based on data collected several years ago, a number of years ago now, at sites across this southern Brisbane region. And here we're looking at what is the effect of increasing numbers of noisy miners on the number of species of small bird. Where you have no noisy miners, sometimes you don't have many small bird species, sometimes you have lots. Where you have lots of noisy miners, you never have lots of small bird species. And if we do the same graph for larger bird species, there's actually a positive trend, which is actually significant, but not nearly so striking. If we put the whole data together across eastern Australia, which is where noisy miners occur, they don't occur in the west, we get, again, almost identical graphs. So these are very strong general phenomena. And these small birds, which are excluded by the noisy miners, are the birds that eat insects and nectar. And that could have flow-on ecological impacts, and the flow-on ecological impacts are described in this paper here. Here's a simplified version of that. Humans, we change the landscape. We simplify or fragment the vegetation. The miners come in, they're abundant and aggressive. The small birds that feed on insect and nectar are eliminated. That is likely to precipitate outbreaks of leaf-feeding insects, and it is also likely to mean that the trees themselves are not so well pollinated and perhaps their seed set could be compromised. that is more speculative. If that is the case, then we're into another positive feedback cycle, because the result will be more degraded forests, which noisy miners will like to occupy, taking us around this cycle of degradation, which is the opposite of the cycle of reforestation or restoration in rainforests that I was talking about before. Now, there's good evidence for this part, there is less evidence for that part. Okay, but nevertheless, there are a range of emerging management and policy responses to these findings. This threatening process, which could be called reduction in biodiversity resulting from noisy miner populations, this is now a declared threatening process in legislation in New South Wales, Victoria, you can see the date there, 7th of April 2014, also nationally. This is government conservation legislation recognising that sometimes a native species can be ecologically harmful. Now, what that means for what we should do next, what kind of action arises from that, that's beyond the time that I now have to talk about. Let me now say as well that there is a suite of other native disruptive species that are increasing in prevalence and abundance in human-modified areas. Examples of those are currawongs, crows and butcherbirds. And again, I don't have time to explain the details. All right. So now I'd like to return to the question that I posed as the title of the lecture then. Must we suppress aliens to restore nature? Must we suppress aliens to restore nature? Using selected examples, I can now complete this matrix by saying, yes, there are some cases where non-native species can be beneficial, and yes, there are some cases where native species can be harmful. We see non-native species being beneficial in cases where humans have trashed the landscape and we're wondering how to restore it. We're seeing native species being harmful in cases where humans have partially or completely trashed the landscape, and that has resulted in altered kinds of species introductions. But what it does mean that this dichotomy between native and non-native is not serving us very well. So I would conclude that species origin is not a useful shortcut to assigning ecological value or management action. And I've given you examples of some dilemmas, specific case history dilemmas. We can simply expect more and more of these dilemmas to emerge over time as the consequences of our changes to ecosystems play themselves out. Here's my favourite example, which is actually my own backyard in inner city Brisbane. I have replanted with a beautiful rainforest. I have very carefully replanted with native rainforest, local species, and it's doing pretty well. I've also kept lists of the birds in my garden, and the diversity of birds in my garden has declined. This is the species which is most common, the noisy miner. So this is my own personal dilemma. There are others which I'm not going to spend time on, but I'm just going to flick through these, because here's another example of a non-native species which is now integrated into a landscape in a way that it has ecological benefit. And here's another example of a native species which could be ecologically harmful. What does this mean for environmental management? So, species origin is often taken as a shortcut to management action. All right, if it's native, great. If it's not, let's get rid of it. the scientific approach would say we should base decisions on evidence, not just species origin. We've got to have the evidence. We have to target interventions then to species that we know are ecologically undesirable. We know that they're not playing a good role, and we also know that they're likely to respond to our intervention. A lot of the effort that goes at targeting alien species for eradication is actually actions which are unlikely to be successful. So it's important to target actions to cases where they might have an effect. And so by doing that, we minimise ecological harm, and we also minimise a waste of time and money. But it does require evidence, which means research. If we don't have the evidence, then we simply should probably be saying, well, we don't know. Okay, there's on a couple of these tables here, there are some fact sheets that are targeted at the general community, and you're welcome to take one or two on your way out, and they're also available for download from the Environment of Futures Research website, not yet this one, which is almost available. And I would like to thank